So we had a launch in Perth at the end of July, and the launch was done in two formats. There were two presenters, myself and a person called James Bowen, who is quite well known in the West Australian context, but maybe not so much so elsewhere, who's a bit of an expert in international trade and international policy. So I got him to help me out with the report to try and pitch it, or put that international pitch in it, which it might not have had if I had just done it so much on my own. And on the day of the launch, we had both of us present, and then we also had a panel discussion. So that panel discussion was Tim Buckley from Climate Energy Finance talking about the finance enablers. It was Bathan Mullen, the new CEO of the Superpower Institute, and Joanna Kay from Zero Carbon Hydrogen Australia talking about hydrogen availability. So I'll talk a little bit more about how that went down when I get through the presentation, but I'll just kick it off now. What I'm going to actually do is show you the sort of pitch of our negotiations and discussions with government, what we're talking to them about these days. Just wanted to start off for this group by explaining what WWF means by green iron. I know there's differences of opinion in this group regarding that. So I'll just start by telling you why we take the public line that we do. It doesn't necessarily mean that we don't entertain other transition ideas, but this is the public line. So there isn't any, as you'll all know, acceptable global definitions of what green iron might actually mean yet. So, or for green steel for that matter. But there are two numbers that you can start to kick around. So the G7 at the last COP, they started to talk about something like 400 kilograms per tonne of steel of maybe fitting into something that might become a definition of green steel or no emission steel. And so that's down from anything up to three tonnes per tonne of steel, depending on whether you count coal mining and related emissions per tonne of steel production that we have today. So go from 2+ something tonnes per tonne of steel down to 400 kilograms, which is quite a drop. But there's another figure too, which says that to be aligned with the Paris Agreement goals for emission reduction, you actually need to be something under 200 kilograms per tonne. So because, you know, we're WWF, we're a conservation-based society, we need to advocate for the optimum definition. So for that reason, for us, green iron and green steel, it only includes any manufacturing types that use 100% renewable energy. And when talking about the hydrogen space, it only includes hydrogen from water electrolysis. We don't include any other methods. So that's the definition. We know it's a lot more complicated than that in practice. So when we first started this campaign, you know, emission reductions was the reason. I'm part of the WWF climate team, so that's obviously the goal. But, you know, we could talk about emission reductions and why we should do that to be good global citizens until the cows come home, but we might not necessarily get very far with our campaign. So instead, we also are putting together economic and trade-based arguments as to why we should actually do this. And they're the ones that we take around to government when we're talking to them, more so than the emission reduction component, which of course we mentioned. So, you know, if steel was a country, it's the third largest emitter in the world after China and the US. So obviously the industry has an emissions issue, but when we're talking to government, we tend to try and look at the other aspects. And then finally, so we have those two aspects of the campaign. We have the economic aspect, we have the trade relationship aspect, and then of course the nature impacts aspect. So it's part of our remit that we need to really document that if we do this thing called a green iron or green steel trade, what will the nature impacts look like and what are the implications of that? So big, long introduction, but just now on to the slides. So a lot of you will already know this again, but this is a little short summary of Australian iron ore. So we're at the moment the dig and ship part of the steel value chain. What does it mean in dollar terms for the nation and for Western Australia, which is my home state where I'm coming from today? So it's 33% of national commodity exports, so not anything insignificant, about $138 billion in the last financial year alone. But for WA, it's closer to 50% of our exports. For WA, it's nearly 62,000 jobs, or about 49% of total mining employment. More insignificantly, it's nearly 74% of WA royalties income. So the chart below that is just showing Australia's top 5 commodity exports, so iron ore, LNG, coal, and the two types of coal, depending on choose to split them. So if we were to add into this bag here alumina as well, then pretty much that explains why the scope 3 emissions of all these exports are more than twice our total domestic emissions. So really that's where our emissions issue lies, in what we're exporting to other countries. But the other point about this is that we have these top 4 export products that are either heavily relying on continued high emissions, or they're very exposed to emission reduction challenges. So what are we going to replace these with in the future that will fit in a low emissions economy? This is the question that we're asking people to consider. We've got these exports. Not only do we want to transition to onshore manufacturing, but we actually need to replace these with less emissions intensive products. For Western Australia, and people will have heard me say this before, there's an additional problem in the steel and iron space, because at the moment we're exporting something like 96% of ores that are hematite ores, which actually aren't really suitable for current green steel technologies that you might be able to get off the shelf and plug in and start today, such as what's being used by H2 Green Steel in Sweden and the other companies that are developing these projects. So that gives us a few choices. Either we can change to mining higher grade ores, which is not really a global solution because there just aren't that many of them. It's a really small part of the current trade, like really small, something like 45 million tonnes global trade a year. Or we can upgrade other types of ores like magnetite, which have largely been sort of ignored until now, because we know we can increase the iron content of those by various processing techniques. But that's not so simple either. There's kind of other questions there. Or finally, you try to sort out a way to use hematite ores in, say, for example, a DRI plus EAF green hydrogen based processing method. So there's lots of issues. And the Western Australian government has not really been very active in trying to sort these out, but they did actually cost them, which was very nice of them. So, and they came up with these lost opportunity costs for Australia if we don't do anything about working out the iron ore compatibility issue, and acknowledging that, yes, we are going to move towards a lower emission steel industry. So they worked out these quite staggering figures. So this was the GDP reduction, 313 billion over that period. 1 in 2 jobs in the Pilbara, so halving the workforce basically up there. Huge cut to WA royalties, and also a big cut to Commonwealth taxes that come from iron ore mining as well. So this is part of the economic argument behind this story. It's not just about emissions. What are we doing in the low emissions future if all of our commodity exports are pretty much tied to high emissions? And then the other part of our argument is the whole, where does Australia fit in the region, and how are we helping this regional value chain decarbonise? I said before that, we have this enormous Scope 3 emissions burden that we're sending out, and we're sending most of that to the Asian regions, so our closer neighbours there. And coincidentally, that's where you have most of the steel producers that are buying these products located. And all of you will know that, Australia's got this high potential for renewable energy generation, should we ever choose to use that. So that if we can instead produce the iron onshore, the argument goes, then you're going to cut the emissions, total emissions of steelmakers quite substantially by moving that part of that production cycle to Australia. There is some argument, although I don't know how well developed this data actually is that if you leave steelmaking where it is in, Korea, Japan, China, and you move the iron making component to Australia, it's quite politically appealing for those countries because most of the jobs are in the end scale part of the steel manufacturing. So they're not going to take a political jobs cut hit by doing that kind of change. Because of the renewable energy potential that we have in Australia, you've heard people say, well, we can also be leaders in renewable hydrogen production if we use that. And ARENA has done some costing on this that says that what does make sense because, because of the lack of renewable energy options in countries like Japan and Korea, it will actually be cheaper to produce the hydrogen in Australia and use it to produce a modified product, a green iron type product. It's a bit disappointing that the Australian government is still talking about hydrogen exports, because I think people have moved on to that and they don't feel that that's the way anymore. And certainly we are advocating for a decarbonised export product instead of any sort of type of hydrogen export itself. The other thing that we explore quite a bit in our work is the whole relationship between the resource industry and trading partners. It would be fair to say that West Australia in particular has sort of fallen over backwards to satisfy its current trading partners in terms of commodity buyers. And I can't really see how that we could do such a steel transition either without quite close integration with those steel producers and really working together to work out what they want. It's a little bit challenging because when we're talking about renewable energy technologies or any type of onshore, upgraded product, it's a lot more complicated than just extracting something and shipping it out. So the degree of cooperation has to be much more sophisticated and politically aware. And the final thing is that, we are in this industrial transition right now, which is industrial revolution scale. And that makes people very nervous about other things, including their own, regional economic security. And it's got geopolitical components that the government kind of does need to recognise and start acknowledging with its partners that, well, maybe we need these quite sophisticated, coordinated cross-border transition plans. So at the moment, we have industry making agreements with their, for example, iron ore producers making agreements with steel manufacturers, but really it would be nicer if government started sort of trying to work out how this might all unfold with minimal impacts to both countries or any country involved in that value chain. The recommendations in the report were essentially these. So we asked for the government to provide $10 billion in a domestic support package to get these industries up and going. That's not the total cost, of course. That's just the government's, part of the seed funding, if you like, to encourage further private sector investment. We asked for a green iron strategy, and I have mixed feelings about this because part of my feelings is it's going to take them years to come up with a strategy, and do we really have that time? Because people, well, not people, but international companies are looking right now about where they're going to invest for their future greener production processes. So if you sit around doing a strategy, is that going to be too late? But of course, can't really not ask for something to be written down. And of course, again, the emissions reduction alignment with global targets, which we're sadly lacking, especially in WA. I'm not sure if people know, but we don't even have an intermediate target in WA. We've just got, by 2050 we'll do this. For the policy development, we asked for the following, that they help provide the enablers, renewable energy, renewable consumables infrastructure, legislative support. They stopped supporting fossil fuel industries, so that money could be well used to fund the transition instead. And this one is the next sort of sticker, that they sort of allow such a market that people can go ahead and produce these products without being penalised for being first movers in that space. And really, the only way to do that is some sort of carbon pricing or greener production premiums to be implemented. National coordination, there is different things happening in different states. You have South Australia and Western Australia quite differently positioned at the moment as to which one of those will move first to do something, a real on-ground thing with green steel. And we can talk about this after this presentation a little bit more because it's quite interesting. And then the other recommendation was, once again, as I said, to just engage trading partners to make the transition less disruptive than it could potentially be. So I thought the report feedback was quite interesting. On the day of the actual presentation for this, we had sort of 68 people there in person, and they were all the sort of right people that you might wish to have there, which I was really sort of pleased about. We had government, we had unions, we had major project developers, some of which I'd been trying to speak to since I started this, but, not managed, but they finally came out of the woodwork, including POSCO and Pilbara Green Iron, actually came to the event and have subsequently spoken to us a little bit more. I think once they saw the line of argument that they were presenting, they felt quite good about engaging. And we ended up, those of you that were watching the presentation, I've seen the recording, we ended up having a really good discussion with those industry people afterwards in the launch event itself. Luckily in WA, we have only one climate positive journalist, and he did write an article about this that was picked up by Australian Associated Press. So thanks to that, we got quite a lot of coverage for the report. Subsequently, I've been sort of tracking it around everywhere that it can go, including we did have a cross-branch briefing session back in August that was arranged for us by the Teals so that we were able to present this in a slightly different way to I presented today, but along those lines of, the economic aspect, the trade aspect, the climate aspect, the nature impact aspect. And then that was quite well and went down quite well, and we did quite a lot of other engagement with that at the time. So I'm just about done now, but I just wanted to talk to people a little bit about what we're doing at the moment. We have done 2 quite large partnership projects with Deloitte to further our work. We sort of need to outsource some things because it's just really me working on this project and Monica, of course. And we've done 2 things with those. The first report is an economic modelling report. So that looks at all the potential technology pathways of what you could do. And it asks 2 questions. It sort of says, how much emissions reduction bang do you get for your buck with this particular pathway? And then it looks at, can that pathway actually be competitive in a global context? And there's some quite interesting answers there. Essentially, a lot of the conclusion is we might struggle to be competitive with gas-based processes, but with green hydrogen-based projects, we could be competitive, providing there was some type of carbon pricing in place. The second Deloitte report is a very important one. It looks at what are the nature impacts of that green iron value chain. There's some quite interesting answers coming out of that, and I can share one of them with you at the moment. It's that, renewable energy rollout often gets criticised for its spatial impacts, meaning the sheer land area size that it's going to impact. And one of the things they did with this report was they actually looked at the real land impact comparison between the current steel production method, if you include coal mining and all of that sort of stuff, and any other type of raw material mining, and found that it's actually potentially smaller than what it would be. Renewable energy land use is actually potentially smaller than what the current land use really is if you count all the variables. So that was kind of interesting. The other project that we're doing is, time and time again, when we talk to government, we're told, well, if you think there's demand from our trading partners for a green iron product, go and prove that. So taking that sort of quite literally, we're looking at doing that now. So starting with Japan, we're actually going to launch on a bit of a documentation exercise about what sort of demand might there be in that current market. Not sure what this is going to look like yet. I mean, we're hoping to sort of set up something that is similar to how Mekla works, but it won't be exactly the same and not that big. And I'll be over there next month it's already this month to do a little bit of research about what sort of demand-based organisations, I suppose, are there in the Japanese market at the moment? How are they working? And could WWF Australia and WWF Japan potentially do something to help set up something like Mekla perhaps over there, or some other mechanism for helping to generate the Japan? So if anyone happens to be going to the AJBC, the Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Council meeting in Japan in October, we'll be having a steel side session at that as well to try and talk about some of these issues. And that is it from me. Hopefully we can have a bit more discussion about anything that people would like to discuss.
Thanks so much, Nicole. So what we'll do is we'll mark this spot, 27:30, as the time that we'll close it off. But I want to ask you a couple of questions. And then if those questions are okay and your answers are okay, we'll leave them in the recording, but you get the option. My first question was, you mentioned that Australia could be competitive on a global scale if it was green hydrogen based, but not natural gas based. Is that the Australian iron producers using natural gas, or is that the assumption that the global standard for producing iron is through green hydrogen rather than natural gas?
So it's a price comparison, and we looked at sort of natural gas-based DRI with an EAF, and there's arguments that you should look at other types of furnaces and things like that, but that's the one we used for this comparison. And it was just, if it was done in Australia versus, say, being done in the Middle East and a bunch of other countries, who would be cheaper? And so for the gas-based process, the Middle East was cheaper. But if it's hydrogen-based, it becomes a little bit different.
I see. And was there
it's green hydrogen.
And was there an expectation or an assumption or any sort of a forecast on whether the rest of the world will adopt a, let's call it more stringent, green hydrogen-based approach to steel manufacturing, or is there an expectation that they'll probably fall back to natural gas?
Well, that's a lot of questions in one question.
That's true.
So the assumption was based on cost forecasts in different countries. What would the price be to deliver an end steel product if the iron component was done in various countries? That's basically. So I guess the assumption of how much adoption in each country was the same. They would all have adopted it, but then how would the price look? Okay. So. And that economic report, we can potentially present that to you a little bit later. It's a lot more complicated than the simple summary that I've given here. Hopefully we'll be able to present that to you. Yeah.
I had one other question, if that's all right. And I don't know if it makes sense, but I heard you say that you found that producing iron using renewable energy ended up with a total overall smaller land use than current technologies, which surprised me because the thermal coal, the metallurgical coal is much more energy dense.
It was to do with the square, the land use area size that was required for each process. Okay. So the problem in a lot of comparisons at the moment, they don't actually go and look at, well, if you've got a coal mine, a limestone pit and an iron ore mine, that surface area, how does that compare? And there are assumptions in there about, how would that raw material be different if it was a different process? it was quite interesting. It's something that I need myself to explore a little bit more. But yeah.
I agree, because my mind immediately goes to, well, what about all the polysilicon mines, right? What about all the aluminum mines that are required to produce the solar panels, in addition to just the land
that's
space
right.
to
Exactly.
roll them out?
Yeah, 100%. And what are your assumptions about how more efficient solar processes and that sort of thing become in the next 5 years? And
Yeah, true.
yeah, this is one frustration I find in this space, and surely other people too, is that you can't really get concrete numbers in what 5 years looks like. It's not really possible. So all you can do is try and work out what options. But the difference, I suppose, to when we first started working on this, we just worked on the emission spaces of steel and things like that. But the energy revolutions are basically a mining revolution, and there's a need to really control those impacts to make it make sense. And this feeds back into your conversation that we were having before this talk, in that maybe part of this is you want to have your production match the consumption and not be out of whack with that. And this is a big problem in say, for example, critical minerals, because pretty much you can get enough critical minerals out of mining standard products like alumina, iron, all these major element mines, if you bothered to get them out of the ore, which people don't, right? Instead, they want to have a new mine specific for this or specific for that. Like there are a lot of issues like that if they were correctly addressed, you could really reduce the land use area that you need for this kind of thing.
Oh, that's quite interesting.
If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. It does. Yeah. Are you open to taking? It
makes sense to me from my background, because I'm a geologist, and I always thought, well, it's pretty nuts that you go and have a nickel mine and you don't bother recovering the cobalt and things like that. And it's all just about economics. Sometimes it's about technology as well, that they can't get it out of certain things as easy as they can get it out of other stuff. But yeah.
So what that makes me think of, it makes me think of the whole idea of industrial ecology, locating various different manufacturers all in the same place, so that the outputs of one, or the waste product of one process, can be an input to the next. And often we don't see that happen because of the availability of land, or for whatever reason. Is it a similar thing with mining, that you wouldn't necessarily go out to a coal mine and be extracting all the other trace elements that would be coming with that ore?
I think there's a lot of factors, and remoteness of where mining usually happens in Australia is one of those. But back to your point about the integration of facilities, I mean, we do have a good example of that in WA, in the Kwinana industrial area, where people do offtake everybody else's waste product. It's one of the few in the world that have been set up like that. And there has been some modelling done in WA for the Okajee area, which is the Midwest area, where we do have magnetite resources. It was a WA initiative called Supercharge, which was I was participated in it. It was everybody, it was industry, it was some government departments, but not strictly government itself. All interested parties, and we actually modelled exactly what you're saying. It's beautifully set up. We picked a hypothetical industrial area and said, okay, say we produce green ammonia and green iron in this area. How could you co-use inputs and outputs to make it more effective? And this is a really good idea. It lowers the cost quite substantially for various things. So, yeah.
Are you open to questions from the floor?
Sure, if people would like to. If not, we can move on to other chats.
Anybody have any questions for Nicole?
I have a question, if you don't mind, Nicole. One of your 5 musts there on your slide was the need to have a carbon price. And just are you able to sort of share what that price has to be to break even from your modelling?
Look, we do have it. I would share it if I knew exactly what the number was. But it's quite similar to other numbers that have been suggested. So yeah.
Okay, and
maybe
it really
for the next presentation. Well, it is, if we're going to be. It sort of has to be, like the costs of getting these industries off the ground are so phenomenal, as you would all know. It's not. How can you do it without being someone making it more competitive for you, at least initially? And that's been, and it's a good driver as well, as we've already seen from CBAM. Even though it's not in place yet, it's really encouraging Asian steel makers to go, oh, this is coming, because they already have to do the accounting right. It's just they don't have to pay any money out until 2027, I think, or something like that. But they're already working out how much it's going to cost them. It's hard to see how you could. Well, I'm not a finance expert. That's climate energy finance territory and things like that. But I can't see how you can do it without that.
And I guess a little bit
not
related.
in a fast turn. I mean, we're trying to do this soon, right? We're not talking about doing it in 30 years' time. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess a little bit related to the need for price and that premium. Similar things were sort of said about solar power, 10 years ago, and then it just became really cheap.
Yeah. So until the industry, it becomes normal for the industry, normalized, which solar power is now becoming a little bit more normal, at least in some sectors, then you're going to have something, I think.
Were you able, in that vein, to include anything in your modeling around, say, the cost of electrolysis becoming, cheaper, and then over the next 10 years, which would sort of mitigate the need, the cost premium between green, iron?
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because what we didn't, so, for example, Chinese electrolyzers are getting very cheap these days compared to other countries. So how does that change the equation? We didn't go into it in that much detail, but we certainly thought about it. But it's a bit like if you were doing in the early days of solar panels and you're trying to predict, what would it be like in 10 years' time? It's really quite difficult. But if you even put that basic assumption in that, you make use of all the Chinese technology, which is far lower cost than what we can do in Australia, then it does drop the price. So, yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Nicole. Sorry.
Someone had a question.
It's all right. Just got a question for Nicole on the presentation. Fantastic presentation, by the way. You said that after the presentation, you got together with a number of different people and had a bit of a discussion. How was it taken? Because, as a manufacturer, we'd like to see a bit of green steel, hydrogen. We'd like to see something out there that is working, that is doing the job and moving us forward. What was the uptake? What was the mindset after the presentation? Were they scared or were they willing to move forward?
Well, I think that people were pleased, and when I say people, like I specifically mean like POSCO was there, and I managed to get a 2-hour interview with them afterwards that I never managed to get before, and they told me everything about their project, and they'd actually made a whole series of slides where they had our recommendations and what they thought of it next to it, and they pretty much almost entirely matched up for what they wanted to get this off the ground. So from that, I think, we're an environmental NGO. That's what we're known for. When we start talking about industry, people go, what's this going on? But when, we're not really saying anything apart from our sort of ideal definitions of what we call green. That is not what these people are saying, because they're already sold on the idea of getting up that sort of industry. They don't need to be sold on that this is a good idea. They already are exploring that. So POSCO is looking in Australia and they're looking in the Middle East. Where can we do this thing? It's not, should we do this? It's like, where can we do it? We want to set up a realistic scale test plan so we can compare the economics of doing this in country A versus B. They're already sort of rolling with it. We don't have to convince them of that. So in that sense, what we're saying is quite complementary. And, the feedback from things like Minister Chris Bowen's office was, well, you guys are pushing on an open door because we're already trying to work out how to do this. But that doesn't mean that it could still end badly and not be done in a way that's best for everybody, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that.
But just another point out to all of you. I mean, so we're doing this demand documentation, and we could have started with China, Korea, or Japan, and obviously didn't start with China for various reasons. They're pretty obvious, but we're really hoping that this model gets up. So if any of you have insight into sectors that we might not be thinking about to approach as part of that demand documentation, I'd be really pleased to hear from you. Or maybe some of your organisations have even got contacts in Japan that we might be able to utilise